So today we're taking a look at the newest Tissot PRX in 35 millimeters. It's a cool watch and I've always wanted to try it, but the 40 was just slightly too big for me. So let's take a closer look at the 35. So we have a diameter of 34.8, a lug to lug with the male end lengths of 44.7. We have a height of 9.9 and a lug width here of about 11 millimeters and length to length of about 23.5. Some other general specifications for this watch, we're going to have a pretty standard ETA quartz movement beating away in here. We do have a sapphire crystal on the front, which is pretty nice to see. The case is done in stainless steel, which is then yellow gold PVD'd. We do have 100 meters of stated water resistance with a regular push-pull crown. Closed case back, you have these pull tabs here for basically interchangeable straps, which hopefully Tissot will come out with in the future. And lastly, this watch retails for $450 directly from Tissot, but I'm sure you can find a discount of maybe 10, 15, 20%, depending on how hard you look. So starting off with the dial here, and I think it is pretty well done. It is what Tissot calls a champagne dial. So it does have that classic goldish champagne color tone to it. It is done in a classic sunray pattern, so you get that kind of bow tie light effect where one portion is lighter and one portion is darker. It isn't the most aggressive sunburst, so I don't think it looks overly cheap, but even still, I'm not the hugest fan of sunburst patterns. We have these very blocky, large hands here, almost rectangular in their shape. We also just have rectangular hour markers and a outer printed minutes track. Each marker has a very slim amount of lume built into it, as well as you can see in the hands. I believe they call it Super Luminova on their website. I don't know if that's BGW9 or not, but it does glow blue, so I'm gonna assume it's kind of along that lane. I like that they kept the text very minimal. We just have Tissot, 1853, and PRX at the bottom here, and of course Swiss made at the very, very bottom. It's not too much text by any means. I do think it's a little bit weird that PRX is the most bold text on the dial, but you know, it is what it is. Thankfully, the hands and the indices are all done in this goldish tone to match the case and the dial itself. At the end of the day, I don't think it hinders legibility too much because you can definitely still see it against the champagne dial. But I do think if maybe they were silver or black, you'd be able to see that a little bit better, but as it still is readable. And then moving the hand a little bit, I actually don't mind the white date wheel because one, you have the black text, which matches the other black elements on the dial, and you have the white of the date wheel matching all the white lume elements on the dial. So there is still a continuity in design, and I don't think it stands out too much. So zooming on the dial here, we do see we have this very fine, almost classic brushing effect that you get with most sunray pattern dials. The Tissot text itself is done fairly well, and to be fair, I mean, it's not that three-dimensional, but at least it isn't misprinted in any way. So looking at the hands, you can see they are done pretty amazingly well. You have a basically three-faceted hand. You have the left facet, the middle one, which is basically flat, and the right facet. And what's interesting is the middle portion has this kind of brushed texture to it. Obviously not only helping with legibility and just kind of overall light play, but it ties in really nice with the markers, which mirror the exact same shape, just a little bit smaller. And this is something I don't necessarily love about the watch. I do love the continuity of design and how they all are not only multifaceted, but multi-polished, multi-brushed markers and hands. But I do think the indices themselves are a little bit too small. The hands are a little bit too dominating. I don't think the hands look mismatched by any means, but I do think in comparison to the indices, they are a little too big, or the indices are a little bit too small. At the hour hand, you can see it is similarly well finished, and this is pretty awesome to see because I've taken a look at some more expensive watches recently and they haven't even been this clean. So good on you, Tissot. So taking a look at the date window here, you can see it is stepped down from the dial and it is kind of almost frosted on each edge to give a little bit of contrast to it. I think it's executed really nicely, really cleanly, and it looks very, very crisply done. At the end of the day, this is a much more highly executed dial design and finishing than I would have expected for this price point. Before we move on, just taking a look at that double marker here at 12. Again, you do have the brushed kind of striated portion on the very top. You have the lumen fill, which is done very, very cleanly and very finely. There aren't any like large swatches missing or anything. And then you have the polished sides. So the markers, the indices, they do shine really well. The brush portions stand out really well with the dial, and it also almost ties into the brushing sunburst pattern of the dial. And then you have this very nice outer edge that contrasts against the dial, but also is somehow still part of the same texture. So there's this really interesting effect. There are actually multiple layers to the dial, and there's a nice continuity between the dial itself and the case because you can see the brushing almost continues perfectly right on. So again, really well executed for the price. And then before I move on, you can see here we do have a brushed and golden chapter ring. It ties in really well with the rest of the dial. It doesn't stand out too much, and it really just draws your eye into the rest of the golden pattern. So overall, it's very nice. There's a large continuity of design language here. So moving on to the case, and this is probably a more interesting point than the dial itself, and obviously this is Gerald Genta-esque inspired. It has that integrated sports watch look. It very much looks like that Vacheron 222 that's recently been re-released, so take that for what you will. But putting that aside for a second, it is still actually just very well done. As you can see on most surfaces, we do have a vertical brushing here on the flat case top. And along the rest of the bracelet, the brushing goes in the same direction, the same graining. Overall, it's just a very uniform brushing. So as you can see, like as I play with the bracelet, it goes from very bright to very dark and shiny. Even though it's not a high polish in-your-face shine, it still has this unique glimmer about it. And of course, the gold tone helps that too. By comparison, I'm wearing the stainless steel bracelet, and again, it does have that same shimmer and shine to it, but I think the steel tones it down slightly, whereas the gold still makes it feel a little bit rich. What I really like about this case is how the polished accents are used. Arguably, I think there could be more polished accents, but we do see we have this very nice one along the entire case side, which really frames the dial and the case itself, and as you tilt it, you get that polished accent to just really pop out in the light. I wish this polished accent was continued along down the side of the bracelet, but as you can see, like between the bracelet links, there's actually polishing. So as you're moving the bracelet, as you're wearing it, you kind of get these polished sections that end up popping out at you. So it's a really nice effect, and honestly a very premium feeling effect from a pretty affordable watch. And another thing I really like about the case shape here is we have this very three-dimensional bezel. It's not flat, it's kind of domed and angled. So it really does stand out. Again, it's high polished on a watch that doesn't have much polishing on it, so it definitely does stand out and grab your attention. You have the polished elements shining on the dial, you have the bezel, you have the highlights of the case shape. So the polish is used very strategically and very well here. Looking at the side of the case here, we do see again we have all brushing in a horizontal grain. I do have a little bit of scratching right there, sign T for the crown, but at this angle you can see how thin the watch really is. The mid case is incredibly thin, and the case back and the kind of bezel-ish dial portion are about just as thick as each other. So when the case back ends up sitting into the wrist, you have a effectively very, very thin watch on the wrist, and this is already just under 10 millimeters, so it does wear very close to the wrist, very thinly, and thankfully very comfortably too. The underside of this bracelet feels weirdly premium, weirdly silky, very smooth. There is definitely space between the links that will let your wrist breathe, which is nice. And again, you have a pretty good amount of articulation between the links. So overall, it does end up conforming to the wrist really well. And you do also have full links and this very smallish, like halfish type link. So you can get a pretty good fit. At the end of the day, you do have a butterfly deployant clasp, which for me personally is not my favorite type of clasp, but even with this watch, again, it's my wrist though, I was able to get a perfect fit. It feels very comfortable, and it's much more comfortable than other deployants I've had in the past. Kind of following from the same point that the underside of the links feel very silky and smooth, the deployant clasp itself has that same feeling to it. So I don't know if it's a coating or just whatever metal Tissot is using, but they did a really good job on this bracelet. Again, as I mentioned earlier, you do have these like quick release tabs right here that you can press on and it opens really easily. At the end of the day, Tissot doesn't really make any straps that fit with the 35mm PRX yet, so it's a little bit of a non-point really. But hopefully they will start making more compatible straps, because this would look cool on rubber or leather or really whatever you want to do with it, as long as Tissot ends up making some higher quality ones. But I know Deluxe has made some straps for the 40mm PRX, so hopefully the 35mm PRX gets some strap options too. So really quickly before I move on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing already the green 35mm Tissot, and just kind of comparing the two, I ended up liking the gold a little bit more. It's a little bit more homogeneous, it looks interesting, and I'm not usually a fan of gold, but for some reason this really catches my eye. The green I like, it's an interesting color. Again, you do have that sunburst, which makes it that kind of almost sea green type color. It has a lot of life and depth to it. And again, the silver bracelet does pop really nicely. The stainless steel is brushed very well, but overall it doesn't grab my attention quite as much as its gold brother over here. It's still a fantastic watch, but for some reason this one captures my eye a little bit more. So here we have the 35mm PRX on my 6.5-inch wrist, and as you can see, I think it wears pretty much perfectly. The 40 millimeter to me is just a little too oversized, and this is my more sweet spot. So I think if you have a wrist similar to mine, this is what you should go for. Obviously, it sits within the bound of the wrist very well. Because you have that integrated styling, it feels slightly larger than 35. I would say it probably feels more like a 36.5, maybe 37 millimeter regular cased watch. It is very thin on the wrist. Again, it doesn't rise up too high at all. It sits very comfortably down. It doesn't dig too much. The deployant butterfly clasp sometimes digs a little, but of course that's just depending on how tight you wear your watch as well. One thing I didn't really mention was the crown. It is nice. It is very nicely knurled, and it is kind of like medium. It's not too small. It's not too large, so it's a decent size. But again, it's a quartz watch. You're not going to be manipulating the crown a ton. And really quickly looking at the side view of the watch, again, it sits very well on the wrist. It sits very thinly. It conforms pretty well. So I'm really impressed by how the 35 fits, how it translates, because again, I've tried on the 40 a couple times and I just really didn't like it at all. But sizing it down to 35, it makes it feel more vintage. It makes the design make sense a little bit more to me, and I just like how it wears now. At the end of the day, I do think the design is a little bit confused because you have a lot of angularity in the bracelet, in the case, and the bezel is very smooth, which I don't think necessarily perfally goes together. The bezel should have a little bit of angularity to it, but then it maybe would look too much like a Vacheron, or too much like a Patek, or too much like a Royal Oak. So at the end of the day, you can only do so much, and for the price, Tissot's definitely done a lot here. It is a good-looking watch. And then really quickly, just because I already have this one on me, again, this one looks fantastic. Obviously, the stainless steel is a little less flashy than the gold. And again, that green dial is pretty fantastic. If you don't already have a green dial, this would be a fun one to get. It's not a very traditional green. Again, it's almost emeraldy. It's almost kind of sea green. Again, you have to see it in person because it's a kind of hard green to describe, and it isn't even coming through perfectly on camera. But yeah, that is the Tissot. So taking a look at the Tissot all loomed up, it's not terribly done. It actually looks a lot better on camera than it does in person, to be fair. Clearly the hands are the brightest part and the indices are not very big, so they don't have a lot of lume on them. It is very legible, but it doesn't last forever, so to be fair, the lume's not really a point here. It's not a factor of whether or not you're going to buy the watch, but I think Tissot probably should have just not put lume on it at all and kind of focused more on the brushing aspect because it looks really good on the watch. Lume, comparing to the Snoopy, again, they have a similar kind of color temperature. It is that classic BGW9 leaning lume signature. But again, it's not a lume you're going to be relying on. If you really need to see time in the dark, do not wear the PRX. So pros and cons of this watch. And for me, one of the biggest pros is just the size and the fit of it, of course. The 40, while it wasn't terrible, and it does have a kind of short lug to lug length because of the integrated style, it still was very flat feeling. It was very like dinner plate-esque, and it felt too big for 40 on my smaller wrist. On people with larger wrists, it's probably fine, but this 35 millimeters is definitely more of a sweet spot with my 6.5-inch wrist. So if you have a wrist like mine, or you just prefer smaller watches, this is definitely the way to go. And it's just comfortable. It fits well. It doesn't pull hairs. It doesn't rise up off the wrist too much. So overall, it just is ergonomically designed, and it fits well. Another thing about the fit is like the bracelet on this watch is really well constructed. When you're kind of putting it on and off wrist and you just feel it in hand, it has a very silky articulation to it. So I'm really surprised by this bracelet. Again, it's not the most expensive watch in the world, but it is surprisingly well made and it feels fairly high quality. So moving on from that point, I think the finishing this watch and really the brushing is done really well. The brushing is very uniform. It's not inconsistent in any way. And the way it's done, it catches the light very nicely. It's not as shiny and bright as an all polished surface would be, but it very nicely disperses the light and it has a very, very soft kind of highlight to the watch. All the polishing as well just highlights the brushing really well. It highlights all the case elements. It kind of makes the, I guess, shape and taper of the bracelet stand out more. It makes the light play a little bit more aggressive on the bracelet, but not in a bad way. It frames the case shape more perfectly. So the polishing really does nothing but help the watch. It would have been nice to see maybe slightly more polishing along the like outer edges of the bracelet to kind of make it pop a little bit more. But other than that, it still does look really good. My last pro would be the fact that the bracelet uses both full-size and half-size links. A lot of the times when you have a butterfly deployant clasp on like an integrated style bracelet, it's all very small links, but they're all the same size. So sometimes you're just kind of out of luck if you're in between sizes or something doesn't fit you quite right. But with this bracelet in particular, you get the small half sizes, and thankfully they include more than one of them. So at the end of the day, you can probably narrow in your fit a little bit better than you could otherwise, and it's a nice attention to detail. So moving on to cons, and although it's probably a little bit petty to say, I don't love the fact that they only use sunburst dials or mainly use sunburst dials. For most applications, I think sunburst ends up looking a little cheaper than the brand would like it to in a way. And honestly, having seen, especially like if you're comparing this gold version, the gold 40mm PRX, it has this really beautiful brush dial to it, and it makes it feel like a much more premium, high quality watch. So had they done a brush dial on this model in particular, I think it would have looked a lot better. And had they just done brush dial for all the variants, I think it probably would have looked a little bit better. But that being said, the sunburst isn't too overly aggressive, so at the end of the day, it's not too bad. Another small con I have with the design is the fact that the markers are either too small or the hands are too big, or it's probably a little bit of both. The hands stand out very much, and that's good for legibility purposes, but I feel like the markers, especially with like the beefier, sporty style design, are too delicate, too dressy. So this watch has a little bit of like a identity crisis in a way to it. In more ways than one, obviously. So I think if they would have just beefed up the markers slightly, it would have been a little bit more of a harmonious design. But as it stands, it's not bad, but it's clearly not perfect. My only other real main con with this watch is the fact that they used a butterfly deployant clasp. I found, at least just my personal experience, it's not as comfortable usually as just a kind of regular fold-over clasp. Sometimes the fit, again, as I mentioned, is a little bit weird. So at the end of the day, I think if they would have just gone with a single fold over, it would have been a little bit better. But as it stands, it's not too bad, and you do get that fully integrated look that they're going for. And then one just very small minor point I would like to add is I wish they had some kind of angularity or geometricness to the bezel itself. Of course, that would have probably looked far too homage-y to something, but at the end of the day, I think this design would benefit from it, and it looks a little bit weird without it. So final thoughts, and honestly, I really like this watch a lot more than I thought I would, especially in this gold variation. I'm not very big into gold. I usually don't like gold tone watches. Rose gold I can kind of get away with, but for me, gold is sometimes too harsh, too shiny, too bright. And I think one of the main things about this watch that I like is it's gold, but it's mainly brush. It's not very shiny, even though, you know, the gold tone itself is kind of a little bit brighter. Tissot size down on the watch, it fits comfortably. It can almost be used as a dress watch because of how small and slim it is. So at the end of the day, this is a versatile watch. You can wear it in most occasions. It is obviously a very sporty looking design, but because of the way it shines, the way it can be dressed down and dressed up, it really can be someone's only watch. I think you're getting a lot of bang for your buck with this watch. Again, I don't think it really has any right to be finished as good as it is. The brushing is done extremely well. The polished highlights really complement every part of the case. So in hand, on wrist, in person, in different lighting situations, the watch really comes to life. And it's a fun watch to play with and turn your wrist around with and just kind of look at the beauty of the craftsmanship of it. This isn't high horology by any means. It's not a Nautilus. It's not a Royal Oak. It's not even a Laureato by any means. At the end of the day, this is just a knock-around watch that happens to be very well finished, looks pretty good, and again, won't break the bank. Anyway, as always, thank you for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you in another one.